My baby dolls, we're back again. Another episode of Genesis is coming up, and we got a great show for you today. We're talking, of course, old-time baseball, and, of course, a lot of you people don't know, but you're going to know after this show, and I implore everyone to run out and get this book. We're going to learn about Lefty O'Doul, baseball's forgotten ambassador. And it was written by Dennis Snelling. It is a fantastic book on a subject that not a lot of us know. It's all in this book, the case why Lefty O'Doul should be in the Hall of Fame and why he should be more recognized than he has. It seems that baseball, left Lefty by the side of the waist, by the wayside. And we're going to learn about the importance of the Pacific Coast League. We're going to learn about Lefty in Japan and MacArthur. We're going to learn about trips with Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe. We're going to learn so much about Lefty O'Doul in the Second World War and what he thought about the attack on Pearl Harbor and the internment of the Japanese. This book is so well written, so historical. It can also be a sociological book on the period of the time that Lefty was, in probably from the 19 teens up until his death in '69. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and of course, you are on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho, and of course, I do a few shows with him. I do Giants baseball, and of course, Lefty O'Doul was on the Giants for a season, and we usually talk about, the old-timers in New York and San Francisco. I also help him out with the Oakland A's, and next week I got Jason Turbo on the show. We're going to talk about those swinging A's and how this team that fought each other and the owner, Charles Finley, won 3 World Series and 5 pennants from 1971 to 1975, another historical period. I am also on Dave Nemec's old-time baseball and trivia with, of course, Sabres' own Alan Blumpkin and, of course, renowned author David Nemec. Now, Lefty O'Doul, baseball's forgotten ambassador. This is so well researched and so just well laid out. Dennis really writes extremely well. It's a page-turner, folks. And when you read it and when you finish the book, you wonder why Lefty isn't in the Hall of Fame because of his achievements. I mean, we're going to go into how he almost hit 400 and, in his coaching career, and he's pretty much pioneered Japanese baseball, and it's all here, folks. And Dennis, he's a pretty much authority on the Pacific League baseball. He's been a senior writer for Helmar Baseball, History of Art magazine, and a member, of course, of Society for American Baseball Research and the Pacific Coast League Historical Society. He is the author of The Greatest Minor League, A History of the Pacific Coast League, 1903 to 1957, and Johnny Evers, A Baseball Life. And without any further ado, welcome to the show, Dennis. How are you today?
Real good, Ian. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, this is going to be I'm so excited to talk about Lefty. Butchertown. Okay?
I live up near Sacramento.
Oh, so you're near the capital, man. So, this is a little north of you, San Francisco. But Lefty grew up in Butchertown. And let me ask you this. How did this shape Lefty, as his childhood and, when he was going, because he was in the Navy and a submarine baseball team as well. How did his growing up in Butchertown shape him?
Well, I think in several ways. I think he never really forgot his roots. Butchertown was an area, of course, where there were butchers. It's called Bayview Hunters Point today. It's kind of in the area where Candlestick Park used to be. And he went to Bayview Grammar School. His first coach was actually a woman named Rose Stoltz, and they stayed close throughout their lives. But Lefty always remembered the kids from his old neighborhood. Whenever he'd come back after the baseball season, he'd go to the school and visit the kids and talk to them. If he'd been to Japan, he'd talk about that. And out of that really came his kids' days, where starting in 1927, he used to have a day where all the kids were allowed in free. They gave away, 5,000 bats. They'd give them balls. They'd put on kind of a show before the game. And he always tried to give back, I think, and always remembered where he was from. And I think it had a big impact on him throughout his life. He also, I think, when he was young, he was as much interested in becoming a cowboy as he was being a ball player, which is kind of interesting to contemplate from someone from San Francisco wanting to be a cowboy, but they're actually, again, in Butchertown, they did drive cattle through the streets of San Francisco into the 1940s, and he was very comfortable on horseback, and in fact didn't really take up playing ball seriously until he was nearly 20 years old.
Yeah, and O'Doul, your book makes a great summary of that. As a young guy, he saw a lot. His uncle was in a bar fight where a guy, died over the price of drinks. Then, somebody threw a cigar underneath, under a plank road, almost burnt down that section. And, of course, the 1906 earthquake. How did all this stuff affect Lefty over here?
Well, the thing that's interesting to me is the connection with his uncle going through the issues he did. His uncle obviously had some problems. He spent time in San Quentin and Folsom for burglary and things like that, and died young in his 30s, and obviously led a troubled life. And Lefty always reached out to people in trouble. In fact, there are stories about people seeing him at midnight bailing somebody out for the umpteenth time, and someone would say, "Why are you helping the guy? He's not doing any better." And he said, "Well, the guy needs help, and I can help him." There's a story where he and a friend were coming back from Japan on a steamer, and there was a stowaway found and thrown in the brig, and Lefty and his friend within, by the next day are feeding him all the stuff from the banquet table, through the slot. And then by the end of the trip, they have him on the last day at the captain's table with them. And of course, his restaurant that he opened in 1958 in San Francisco that became a landmark, he would open that every Thanksgiving and Christmas to allow those less fortunate, as he called it, a chance for a good meal. I think that was, I think there's a connection there between, him being able to relate to people who had trouble and wanting to help them when he could.
Yeah, and how did he find baseball, Lefty? Because I know his dad convinced Lefty to join the South San Francisco parlor of the Native Sons of the Golden West. And you wrote in here, the Native Sons also sponsored baseball as well. How did this link help Lefty understand and actually take an interest in baseball?
Well, the Native Sons, that was a very popular league. In fact, there would be ex-professionals playing on some of the teams. The Native Sons is a fraternal organization. It's open to anyone born in California, and it's meant to further the people knowing the history of the state and preserving it. And it was formed in the 1800s. And Lefty's father was part of that organization. And they had, again, a baseball league that would play on Sundays around San Francisco, and it was like a 12 or 14 team league, and it was very good quality. And Lefty, again, had some success. He played a little semi-pro ball, and of course he had the grammar school championship that he took his team to, and so he was well known as an excellent athlete. And the team had been trying to get him to play for them. And finally, his dad took him to a game, and the starting pitcher that day was unavailable, as the story goes. And so Lefty pitched, did well, and ended up pitching them into the championship. And during that time attracted the attention of the San Francisco Seals, who signed him to a contract. And beginning his professional career at the age of 20.
And a lot of people don't know about the San Francisco Seals. They don't even know of how instrumental the Pacific Coast League was, because Major League Baseball was east. We live in a world today where California is littered with teams. But, I like to, you call it minor leagues, and I say, well, I got to question them on the show. The talent in that Pacific Coast League, they produced the DiMaggios, and they produced so much more. Was it like a Major League Baseball league when you evaluate it?
Well, I think in the 1920s, an argument could be made that there were several teams playing in that league that were better than some of the bottom feeders in the Major League, certainly. You had owners that had money and had means. And the Coast League was rather isolated. There really wasn't, you had about 1,500 miles of prairie and mountains between the rest of the country and the coast back in, the early 1900s. The Pacific Coast League really started out as an outlaw league. They weren't affiliated with organized baseball at all because they wanted to sign their own players, and they actually raided Major League rosters in 1903 when they started. They were taking advantage of the war between the American and the National Leagues and actually picked off a few Major League players. And their ambitions off and on were always to try to become a third Major League. And this went on from the inception of the league all the way into the 1950s. The league, people don't realize that people like Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams and Paul Wainer and Harry Heilman and Lefty Gomez, they signed with Coast League teams. They didn't sign with Major League teams. Ted Williams was a high school junior when he signed with the San Diego Padres in 1936, and the Padres outbid the Yankees and the Cardinals for him. The league was fiercely independent. There was some drafting of their players, but they limited it at times, and they held on to their players. And I think what was different about that minor league, winning a pennant meant something, and the rivalries that you had in that league were serious rivalries between the fans and the players. It was a great place to play. The pay was it was pretty equivalent to major leagues at certain times for the players. The weather was good, the travel was good, and the competition, the level of play was excellent.
Let me ask you this, because I had Robert Garrett on my show a few weeks ago, and he wrote the book on the San Francisco Giants and the whole move from New York to San Francisco. What was the feeling when the Giants were coming to San Francisco and they would take up residence in Seal Stadium? It was only 24,000 seat stadium compared to the Polo Ground in New York, which was huge compared to that.
I think everyone was really excited. The Seals had fallen into disrepair. The owner of the Seals, Paul Fagan, had lost interest once it became clear the Pacific Coast League wasn't going to become a third major league. The team in the 50s was actually bought by its own employees for a couple of years till they ran out of money, and then the Red Sox had purchased them, and they became a de facto farm team for the Red Sox. Plus, by that time, television had come in and really hurt the minor leagues because now people could see Major League Baseball. Now, people think no one had seen Major League Baseball on the West Coast. That wasn't true because teams trained here every spring. There were exhibition games out here. And even back into the 1800s, the New York Giants would come and barnstorm through San Francisco and draw crowds of 20 to 25,000. So people here were aware of Major League Baseball. But at the same time, the idea of major leaguers actually coming and playing and they could see every day was exciting to them. And by then the Coast League had started fading a bit in the 50s, as the rest of the minor leagues had been hurt, because now Mickey Mantle and Jackie Robinson and those folks, you could see in your own living room on the weekends at the baseball game of the week, et cetera. So I think by that time, people were ready for Major League Baseball. Certainly there was some nostalgia for the old Coast League, but I think people were excited to see the big names they had read about and seen only on TV.
And let me ask you this. It was a very turbulent time for Lefty during the First World War. Again, the United States got into the fight in 1917, but Lefty enlisted. And, the thing at the time was the government's orders of work or fight. Why did Lefty decide to enlist, especially when he was just drafted by the New York Yankees?
Well, I think, like everybody else, he wanted the opportunity to serve. He went down and he was in San Pedro, California, in Southern California, then was trained as a torpedoman. By the time he was done with that, the war was basically over. He also played ball. They had a tremendous team. There's a photo in the book that actually came out of Jimmy Reese's scrapbook, personal scrapbook, they ran across. And on that team were Bob Musial, Harry Heilman, Howard Empke, Jimmy Reese, of course, and Lefty. There were a lot of teams, shipyard teams, shipyard leagues, things like that. There was even talk of Babe Ruth coming over, playing in the Los Angeles League, and then there was some backlash from the public saying, these guys should be fighting rather than playing, and a lot of that was backed off. But there were a lot of, they were like the winter leagues in the 1920s, where they would form teams and bring players out to the West Coast. This gets back to saying that Major League Ball was seen on the West Coast. During the teens and 20s, teams would come, players like Rogers Hornsby and Harry Heilman would come back and play with a mixture of Major League players and Coast League players in a winter league that was also very popular. So I think, of course, Lefty the call to duty, and he didn't end up obviously going to war, but obviously it was a big impact on him.
Also, during the time, the Spanish flu swept through America, killing more people in the world than the First World War in a matter of months. His father caught tuberculosis, the White Death of the 19th century. I mean, how did this impact Lefty? Because the war was coming to an end. The Spanish flu, San Francisco was one of those cities like Boston, New York. Everyone's walking around with a mask. How did Lefty endure this?
Well, San Francisco was hit hard by the flu, and his father died during that time, which was a big impact on him. His father died of tuberculosis, not the flu, but it was at the same time. And I think it would be hard, the combination of the war and the death all around you had to be tough to go through. I think it probably made Lefty a little bit more independent and resilient. He was an only child, remained close to his mother, but I think his father's death impacted him a lot.
And let me ask you, now that he's going to the Yankees, he goes to the Yankees in 1919, and they are not the team that, like you mentioned in your book, they're not the team that we know that would eventually become. We know Miller Huggins was the manager. How were the 1919 Yankees when Lefty was there?
Well, they hadn't had much success. They didn't even have their own ballpark at the time. They were sharing the Polo Grounds. Yankee Stadium was about 4 years away. Babe Ruth wasn't on the team. The Yankees had not won a pennant. They'd finished second a couple of times. Most famously in 1904 when they lost on a wild pitch by Jack Chesbrough, lost the pennant. So they really weren't a glamour team. The New York Giants were the glamour team with John McGraw and Chrissy Mathewson, who retired by then, but McGraw was still there. And they'd won a pennant as recently as 1917 and had won, I think, 6 or 7 pennants by that time. So the Yankees were kind of the second-class team of New York at that point.
And let me ask you this. He spent the 1919 and 1920s in the Bronx, but Huggins wasn't totally set on O'Doul pitching. What was Noah Huggins thinking at that time?
Well, if you go back to even when Lefty first signed with the Seals, there were arguments over whether he should be an outfielder or a pitcher, because it was clear he was a tremendous athlete, great speed, great strength, great hand-to-eye coordination. He was good at almost every sport that he ever tried. And so there was back and forth. I think Lefty, he talked about, being a ham. What's the use of doing something if nobody's watching? And I think he liked pitching. It was the center of attention. That's what everybody's watching. I think he enjoyed pitching. But he was a much better hitter than he was a pitcher. And I think Huggins grew frustrated with that. There were certainly people even around the Yankees who, talked about O'Doul's ability possibly being another Ty Cobb. And as much as people might have laughed at, you looked at his averages at his peak, he's not far off that level. He was a great hitter. So I think there was some frustration. Plus, Lefty hurt his arm, most likely in his first spring training in 1919. And after that, Bob Stevens, the San Francisco writer, famously said of Lefty, he could run like a deer, but unfortunately he also threw like one. And John Kieran of the New York Times said Lefty had a magnificent curveball that fooled everybody once but never fooled anybody twice. After he hurt his arm, he really just didn't have the durability or the fastball to last, but he was stubborn in wanting to continue to pitch. And he did have a champion in a guy named Harry Sparrow, who was the business manager of the Yankees at the time, kind of equivalent to general manager today, who said, we're still going to keep O'Doul. I think he can be another Ty Cobb, and you're only trading him over my dead body. And, of course, that's exactly what happened. Sparrow had a heart attack in 1920, and the Yankees sent Lefty back to San Francisco for the 1921 season after he sat on the bench in 1919 and 1920, appeared in a handful of games, and other than getting his first career hit off Walter Johnson, he really just didn't distinguish himself at all, mostly because he didn't get to play at all. It was almost like the bonus babies of the 50s, who, if you remember, when they were required to be on major league rosters for 2 years, even though they weren't ready, they just sat and never got into games. That was really Lefty's lot those first 2 years of the Yankees.
And, when he went down to San Francisco this time in 1921, he came into his own as a pitcher. He won 25 games. He had a 2.39 ERA, and he batted .338 in 136 at-bats. So, again, in 22, he's back with the Yankees, but again, Miller Huggins isn't using him. Now, we all know, at least those who know about Lefty O'Doul, he had a colorful personality. And, of course, the Babe was on the team by that time. Did that impact his relationship with Miller Huggins and why he didn't want to play him as well?
I think indirectly, Lefty definitely didn't take things seriously. I think he enjoyed being in New York. I think he enjoyed the nightlife. And, he wasn't as mature as perhaps he should have been. And I think some of the Yankees, including Ruth, were not great examples for him. He became great friends with Ruth, spent a lot of time with him. But, I think Lefty really, I'm not sure he took his career seriously at that point and understood what he was in danger of flitting away. And Huggins was a pretty serious guy, and I think there was that conflict. Huggins recognized his talent, but just couldn't seem to get through to him.
And then, even with the World Series, I don't even think he pitched. I think he pitched a batting practice, if I'm not mistaken. He kept him around.
Yeah,
and then after that, they traded him to the Red Sox. Now, in the Red Sox, there's one game that stands out, and I want you to talk about. It's still a record. July 7th, 23 at Dunn Field in Cleveland.
Yes, he does hold a major league pitching record that stands to this day. Frank Chance was the manager. The Red Sox were terrible. And Frank Chance, of the famous Tinker Devers to Chance, Chicago Cubs champions, and player manager of that team, had had been out of baseball for about 6 years because his health was bad, and he took over the Red Sox, and they were a terrible team, but it was Chance's opportunity to get back into the game. And, Lefty ended up pitching for the Red Sox, pitched more than he had for the Yankees, but still was pretty much a spare part. And one day against Cleveland, he gave up 13 runs in one inning, 16 overall in a 3-inning relief stint. Interestingly, all 13 runs were unearned, but Chance just left him out there, and Lefty always claimed that it had to do with him missing curfew, spending some time with his old Yankees teammates. But yeah, he holds a record for most runs allowed in an inning, and I think most runs allowed by a relief pitcher in a game.
And then what they do is the Sox send him down to Salt Lake City, and he gave up pitching because of those problems. But now he becomes a fantastic hitter, and he becomes so fantastic. It is said, and I don't know if this is true. I don't know what your research, showed you, but Cubs owner William Wrigley Jr. was so impressed by O'Doul after watching him hit in the minors. We know he plunked down $30,000 for him. But supposedly, this is it. This is what's the big thing. O'Doul is the only player that Wrigley ever obtained without any input from his scouts. Is that true?
That is true. At least that's what Wrigley always claimed. And he always called him my O'Doul. And Lefty, of course, had had a couple great seasons back to back. Just before Wrigley signed him, he'd gone 6 for 6 twice in 3 days. When Lefty got on, and I think he went 19 for 20 in a stretch. He could get on streaks that were just incredible. And Wrigley signed him for the Chicago Cubs in 1926, but Lefty didn't stick with the Cubs because their new manager, Joe McCarthy, didn't like him and sent him back to the Coast League.
And let me ask you something, because I always find it fascinating. Like, these guys get bought for $30,000, but like Lefty would be paid how much? 15 at the most, 20 at the most, and these guys are still raking in the profits that these guys bring in the stands at Wrigley, in Beantown, in New York. So why give up so much money for a player like that and not pay him for what he's worth?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's the eternal question that all players ask, and has been, I think that kind of activity led eventually to the players' union as we know it today.
Yeah, it's that whole reserve clause and all that. And,
right.
I love Marvin Millen. I have shows on him and stuff like that. I'm a huge Marvin Millen maven. But now we get John McGraw. And here we go with the Giants. McGraw has the same sort of personality of O'Doul, except he's a lot harsher than O'Doul. But he viewed O'Doul as a limited player because he burned too much midnight oil. I mean, he was doing the same thing, McGraw, gambling. He had assets in Cuba and in cavorting with women and all this stuff. Why didn't he like Lefty O'Doul when Lefty was doing pretty much the same stuff he was doing?
Well, he saw Lefty as a platoon player. He played him almost only against right-handed pitchers. And he didn't think Lefty was a strong outfielder, which Lefty wasn't a great outfielder. Unlike some of the there's a lot of great hitters who came out in the 1920s and 30s and didn't make it because they weren't good fielders. People like Snead Jolly, Ike Boone, et cetera. You look at their numbers and they're incredible offensive numbers, but they were also they were not very athletic, which O'Doul was, so he could make up for some of that. But he was 31 years old when he got back to the Yankees, and you kind of to the Giants rather, and you kind of get typecast, I think. And that's the way McGraw saw him, and the next year Lefty would prove McGraw wrong.
And this is what This is what bothers me, because this has become a pattern with Lefty. The guy bats .319 in 114 games in 1928, and he gets traded.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just kind of interesting. Some of it, I think, is the prejudice against age, and not giving a guy an opportunity to show what he can do.
And when he was traded to the Phillies, between, I don't know what was worse, playing at Shives Field or the Baker Bowl. I mean, Philadelphia had two teams at the time, either one of them. But Lefty was kind of infatuated with the right field wall over there. It was very claustrophobic, Baker's ball. But he did quote Lefty, "I looked at that high fence and felt sure I could hit it." And more often than not, he did. Now, did he have to, in your research, alter his swing or get a feel of the dimensions of the puck? Because what I failed to mention so far, and shame on me, Lefty was really a scientific hitter. He really studied hitting.
He did. He kept book on all the pitchers he'd ever faced. He was one of the first people to actually study film of himself hitting. And he would adapt his approach based on the pitcher. Sometimes he'd get a pitcher out there who threw like the pitcher who was going to go the next day. He practiced incessantly as a hitter. And I think his philosophy was still developing at this time. He would adapt his approaches. But it's interesting, his record home and away is very similar. I think he's one of 14 players who had a 300, 400, 500 split for his career in the major leagues, meaning a 300 lifetime batting average, 400 on-base percentage, and a 500 slugging percentage, both home and away. And I think he's one of only 14 players to do that.
And let me just mention some. I'm not such a statistics kind of guy, although I'm a tax attorney and I like numbers. But these numbers are outstanding, and I just want to give the listener what kind of player Lefty broke out in 1929. In 154 games, he banged out 35 doubles, scored 152 times. He drove in 122 runs. He walked 76 times, contributing to the National League leading 465% on base percentage. He is the only baseball player in history to have a season with over 30 home runs and less strikeouts than home runs with only 20. Actually, I thought it was 19. He established a National League single record with 254 hits, which was matched the following season by Bill Terry. 398 batting average, for God's sakes. He almost hit 400. It's the highest of any National League outfielder in the 20th century. Unbelievable.
Well, and he did that. He was hitting second in the order as well, so to drive in 122 runs. And he was also a great influence on future Hall of Famer Chuck Klein during that time as a hitter.
And to make a case again, if that season wasn't good enough, he turns around in 1930 and he hits 383 with the Phillies, who lost 102 games. He batted, and he, the pitches, sported a 6.7 earned run average, and the whole National League batted 303 that year. They say that the ball was juiced that year in 1930 also, but then he gets traded. What the heck? Why would you trade a guy who's almost hitting 400 to Brooklyn?
Well, and not only hit almost 400, but he didn't get to hit against Phillies pitchers who were the worst in baseball. So he hit 420 if he could have hit against them. Again, he was turning 34 years old. The Phillies, he was really the only regular in their lineup that was over 30. They needed pitching. And they were also, at the same time, the Philadelphia Athletics were a tremendous team at that time. That was Connie Mack's second great dynasty, winning the World Series in 1920 and 1929 and 1930. So the Phillies weren't drawing at all. And they felt they needed to get better. In their first year with Lefty, they played almost 500 ball, but the second year they fell back, as you said, and lost more than 100 games. So he was their most marketable commodity to come up with pitching, and so they sent him to Brooklyn.
It's unbelievable. And, of course, his career was pretty much not the same. He was going back to the Seals and where he would manage for the next 17 years. But now we're getting into two things about Lefty. Number one, he visits Japan in 1931. And number two, he starts barnstorming with, like, Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth. Well, first I want to talk about the lesser of the two. Why did Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig take Lefty with them?
Well, Lefty went with Lou in 1931 as part of an all-star team. It was the first all-star team that had, Major League all-star team that had visited Japan in nearly a decade. And Babe didn't go on that trip. The Japanese had wanted Ruth to come over a long time and could never convince him. Lefty kind of fell in love with Japan in 1931, immediately made plans to return in 1932. He actually led the team in hitting with 615 in 1931 as well. He came back and coached college players in 1932. There was no Japanese professional league at the time. And it was the college players, it's called the Big Six League, still exists today and is still extremely popular. And started making plans to bring Ruth over. He started working with some of the friends he made in Japan and a newspaper publisher there to bring another Major League All-Star team over in 1934 with the idea that he would be the person who could convince Ruth to come over, which he was successful in doing, and that was the most famous of the tours, of the goodwill tours to Japan, where Ruth and Gehrig and Charlie Gehringer and Jimmy Fox and Connie Mack all went over, and that was a tour that Lefty actually organized.
Let me ask you this, and then I want to go into a little of the origins of Japanese baseball going back to 1872, because I think it's important for the listeners to get a general sense that baseball was played, 60 years before Lefty arrived. But the big thing that stands out, and you mentioned in your book, the invasion of Manchuria by Japan. Why did Hoover not just pull back everything, including baseball, when this kind of aggression started?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think there were people who, saw a difference in the military side of Japan versus the people of Japan. And I think Lefty falls in that camp. I think he always separated them out. And I think there were those, the 1934 tour, I think a lot of the players thought they could use baseball to heal relations between Japan and the United States, and maybe if we understood each other better, that things would change. So there was definitely, I think, undercurrent of that. That's a good question.
Yeah, that's because the thesis paper I had to do 30 years ago to graduate college is how China survived the Japanese invasion. And in my recollection, and we're going back 30 years to when I was around, 21, 27 years, I'm just rounding. Baseball, I read, continued throughout Japan throughout the 1940s, even with all the bombing. But it stopped in 1945. Why did they stop in 1945 out of all the years? I mean, the war was coming to an end, but the United States was still bombing the hell out of the cities.
Well, I think that's why they stopped playing. I think it's that and manpower. They had to call more and more of their younger and younger men into combat, and then I think the war was getting closer to them than it had in the earlier years. So it just became impossible to play. And I think there was also an undercurrent that it was an American game. They had actually banned during the 1940s using American terminology for like strikes and balls and the bases, etc. And there had always been kind of a push and pull between the Japanese government and the baseball establishment that existed in Japan on whether baseball should be played at all, because it wasn't a Japanese sport, it was an American sport, among those that were more aggressive.
And it's really strange with the Japanese, and I'll tell you why. I don't think you wrote it in the book, but Japan in 1868, they had pretty much a bloodless revolution, and the 1868, ushered in what we know now as the modern Japanese country. Matthew Perry opened it in 1850 by sailing across the Pacific and opened it up for the United States. 1868 was the revolution, and by the 1890s, they had especially German advisors under Otto von Bismarck to build up the Japanese Navy, and they had experts from Britain and France and Russia all to contribute to the Army. But baseball started early in 1872. How did this come about?
Well, it kind of dates back to what you're talking about, the birth of the modern era of Japan. When they opened up their society, they realized they were behind in a lot of things. They'd been isolated. They'd been self-isolated in a lot of ways. And so they brought over educators and technicians and things like that to help them catch up with the rest of the world. And one of those men was a man named Horace Wilson, who lived in San Francisco and came over to teach English at what is now Tokyo University. And one day, as the story goes, he was looking for some kind of exercise for his students and struck upon the idea of showing them how to play baseball. And it became instantly popular. And at the same time, a couple years later, there was an engineering student named Hiroshi Hiraoka who traveled to New York, studied abroad, as part of this opening of the society, and fell in love with baseball and brought that back. And he was those were probably the two big things that created the interest in baseball in Japan, were those two people and their experiences that they brought to the country.
Now, in the 1930s, how many times did Lefty go to Japan?
He must have gone at least 7 or 8 times. He went up until almost 1938.
And by that time, I think the Japanese, actually grew to love him almost like a father figure. I mean, he was around 40 at that time, 41 and 38 when the restrictions started coming up. Because you got in the book, he was walking down the street and there was Japanese visitors, and they were like, "Oh my God, O'Doul-san, O'Doul-san." He really became like a hero in Japan.
Right. Well, and that happened in San Francisco. That was the Japanese
right.
Some Japanese businessmen had come to San Francisco and just happened to see him. But yeah, he was extremely popular. He went over there to teach. He went over there. Again, one of the things that happened was right after at the end of the 1934 tour of Babe Ruth, he'd been talking to them for 3 years about, that they really needed to establish professional teams. The Japanese believed in the purity of amateurism, and they weren't crazy about what they considered mercenaries, paid people to play. But he kept planting the seed during the early 1930s that that they were quitting their play before they even reached their peak, that players reached their peak in their mid to late 20s, and they weren't playing anymore after they were 21, 22, 23 years old once the college years were over. And so at the end of the 34 tour, he stayed behind and helped form what became the Tokyo Giants, now the Yomiuri Giants, which are kind of the Yankees of Japan as far as success goes, and actually arranged for them to tour the United States in 1935 and in 1936. Especially the 35 tour was especially popular in the United States. And out of that, he would come back over and help make sure that the Japanese professional baseball was continuing to grow and thrive. And there were even some Americans who went over and played in the 1930s in Japan before the war made it difficult for them to stay.
And and during his trips to Japan in the 1930s, like I mentioned before, simultaneously he was managing the Seals as well, but he inserted himself as a pinch hitter.
Yes, in fact, he was the first. He pinch hit up into his into his 40s regularly, and in fact, in 1938, he became the first man in Coast League history to hit pinch hit home runs in both games of a doubleheader. He was still remained an excellent hitter into his 40s.
And you know what's interesting about Lefty? And a lot of people, he literally cultivated Joe DiMaggio, but he had a hands-off approach with DiMaggio. How did he get DiMaggio? Number one, and what was his relationship with DiMaggio? Because later on they would go touring together after Joe's career. And did Joe look at him like the father figure or the wizard? I mean, what was their relationship when Joe was very young?
Well, Joe had signed with the Seals originally full-time in 1933. He played the last weekend of the 32 season with them in kind of an odd arrangement. His brother brought him, and they had an opening, so he just played a 3 games. There wasn't a real contract. But in 1933, he's 18 years old. He had a 61-game hitting streak. Everybody knows about the 56-game hitting streak, of course, of the Yankees. He had a 61-game hitting streak in the Coast League at the age of 18. Became an instant sensation. Hurt his knee the next year, and that was the year, 1934, that Lefty finished out his major league career. And Charlie Graham, the owner of the Seals, had always wanted Lefty, when his major league career was over, to come back and manage in his hometown in San Francisco. So Lefty did that, and part of that also was that Charlie wanted Lefty to work with Joe. It had already been agreed that he would be sold to the Yankees, but he would stay an extra season in San Francisco. So Joe hit .398 that season in 1935. And Lefty said he pretty much left him alone. He gave him some basic advice, but a lot of what what Lefty was there to do with Joe was to explain to him, preparing for life in the major leagues, especially since he was going to be in New York, and Lefty had experience in New York. He had gone back to the Giants, was the hero of the 1933 World Series. So he'd gone through, and in Brooklyn he'd won another batting title. So he knew what life was like back in New York, and helped prepare Joe for what it would be like with the press, etc. And they remained friends through their life. I think the relationship was more like older brother, younger brother. Joe would turn to Lefty for advice. I mean, most famously in the 1951 World Series, when he was slumping, he asked Lefty for some hitting advice. But they remained friends the rest of their lives, played a lot of golf together. Of course, toured when Lefty took Joe with him in 1950 and 1951 to Japan on tours in 1954 as well, famously with Marilyn Monroe. Soon after Joe's wedding to Marilyn, Lefty's wife and Marilyn went to Korea, where Marilyn entertained the troops there while Joe and Lefty stayed behind and worked with coaching the Japanese. By then, Lefty was extremely well known as a legendary hitting instructor. Even while he managed the Seals, he was mentoring Ted Williams, Gene Woodling, Ferris Sane, Dom DiMaggio. He really had become a legendary hitting instructor as well as a manager and the face of the Coast League and an ambassador to Japan at that time.
And you mentioned Korea, and I was going to mention this a little later, like in about 5 minutes, but you put that picture in of Marilyn Monroe, and then you look at both O'Doul's face and DiMaggio's face, and if every picture tells a story, that one certainly does.
That one really does.
I mean, after 9 months later, they would both be divorced. But let me ask you this. the Japanese invade, well, they don't invade, they attack Pearl Harbor, okay? And then, of course, you got a couple of skirmishes off the coast of California. I know a plane was shot down over Oregon. And then, of course, Roosevelt issues the order, and Earl Warren enforces the order that all Japanese Americans, for the most part, are in intern camps. I know O'Doul was appalled. He felt a sense of betrayal against the Japanese when they attacked Pearl Harbor. How did he feel about interning the Japanese?
He was really silent about it. And living on the West Coast with the Japanese, attacks, I don't think he was, knowing what I have learned about him and his family's attitudes, I doubt he was very enthusiastic about it. But 97% of the people in the country thought that the internment was the right thing to do at that time, which is, the kind of thing we all need to look at ourselves at, and in times of panic, do we make the right decisions? At the same time, as much as Lefty was appalled, the minute the war was over, he was in Japan trying to relocate everybody, remind everybody the military was separate from, the people who waged the war was different from the people who lived in Japan. And he was almost immediately, within a month or two, he was there and trying to find ways to reconnect the U.S. and Japan relations, which eventually led to, I think, really his greatest legacy on that tour in 1949.
And what struck me about this in your book was that MacArthur called upon Lefty O'Doul to help out with relations between Japan and the United States, because morale is so low, which it should be. I mean, all the cities were bombed out. They were poor. My grandfather was one of the occupational forces under MacArthur, and I have books up to my ceiling regarding the occupation. But let me ask you this. This is what astounds me. MacArthur never wanted to share stage with anyone. He fired a colonel during the 1943 campaign in New Guinea because he gave an interview to Life magazine without MacArthur's consent. Only MacArthur could go to Life magazine because he was the one that's communist. He knows the Japanese. Why share the stage with Lefty?
Well, I think he was looking for answers at the time. There were real problems with morale. The communists were making inroads. Some of the players talked about when the SEALs went in '49. Some of the players talked about there were communists almost on every corner, standing on soapboxes. The Japanese were in hard times. They were desperate, and desperate people listened to desperate messages. I think he was really concerned about where the country was headed. And someone suggested a baseball tour. Lefty had tried a couple of times, 47 and 48, to get permission and couldn't. I think by this time, MacArthur had always, he was a baseball player himself, and at West Point, he was a big sports fan. And I think he saw that as a vehicle originally right after the war that could, recognizing the Japanese appetite for sport. But finally having a popular American come over who knew the Japanese. When he got there, MacArthur talked to him and said, "You're finally home." Lefty did feel at home there, and I think that came across to the Japanese. And some of his actions over there went beyond the ball field. Some of the things that he did regarding orphans and the colleges and talking to kids about, how to be successful and the right way to play the game and the right way to study. All of those things made tremendous impacts on the Japanese during that tour.
And you put it in your book about O'Doul's tour in Korea. Now, I was born 17 years after the Korean War ended. It ended in '53, and my uncle was a veteran, and my friend's father, who's thank God still alive at 86 years old, was part of the U.S. Marines division at the Chosin Reservoir when the Chinese came across. And, you know, the government and the press was saying, hey, this is not a war, it's a police action. But O'Doul was almost aghast at what he saw on the front lines. Let's describe that.
I think that was a very interesting moment because I think people, you know, and even in the book, people probably don't realize how using that term was just not done. And for a public figure like him to come back and say, you know, this isn't a police action, this isn't a skirmish, this is a war. This was in 50 when he and Joe DiMaggio, after the 49 tour with the SEALs, he didn't want to bring another team back. He just came back individually with Joe DiMaggio, and they coached youth players and everything. But they also visited soldiers on the front line. And they were close enough they could hear the shelling thing. So I think it was a really, it brought home what that was. And I think there was hesitancy. The reason people didn't want to call it a war is they'd just gone through World War II. We don't want to get involved in another war. And I think the politicians felt it was best not to call it that. But once he saw that and he came back, I mean, he publicly said, you know, what the soldiers want you to know and what I want you to know is this is a war. This is a serious thing. And I think that was a very interesting thing for him to say and a very courageous thing for him to say.
And it really was. And you know what's parallel here? You know, they say the Korean War was the forgotten war, and Lefty O'Doul was the forgotten guy in baseball, but 53,000 people died in a matter of less than 3 years. It took about that many soldiers for 10 years in Vietnam to show you how much O'Doul was correct in his analysis of what he saw on the battlefield. Asking any of these guys who served, it was a living hell. It was the longest retreat of the Marines out of the Yalu River Basin from Chosin all the way down to the 38th parallel, which is still fighting today as we see on TV. You say to a Marine, that was a retreat, they'll rip your head off. I mean, I was so stupid when I was younger, like, you know, when I was, say, maybe 8 or 9 years old, I'm like, well, you're up in the mountains. You're freezing cold. What did you eat? They're like, eat? They said, hey, get the private another helping of snow. He's like, we had to cock our guns every 10 minutes just to keep them from frozen, sitting up in a tree while the Chinese ran right past them. There was no time to sleep or eat. One of my friend's father got frostbite on his big toe and had to walk down the side of the mountain, because the MASH units couldn't come get him by helicopter, get his toe amputated. That's war. That's war. That's
yes. Yes.
You know. So the Giants come, San Francisco. O'Doul is happy as a clam. Nixon shows up. There is huge celebrations all over. And then O'Doul goes to Candlestick Park and says, what the hell did they do? Let's explain that.
Well, Candlestick Park was built basically in Lefty's old backyard. In fact, there's a hill that used to rise above kind of the third base side of the stadium. And he used to always talk about herding sheep on that hill and made the joke that the wind used to blow the sheep off that hill. He thought it was a terrible place for a ballpark. He wasn't terribly wrong about that either. It was on a point that jutted out into the bay, and the wind was just, having gone there many times, the wind was just relentless, and it was incredibly cold at night. So he wasn't a big fan of Candlestick at all.
Yeah, and he was right, because it affected the All-Star game when it was there in 1962. It blew the pitcher right off the mound, and people just hated it. It's amazing how Mays hit as many home runs as he did playing in Candlestick Park. But, again, like we mentioned, O'Doul was colorful. Even up to the time of his death, when he was in the hospital after the aneurysm and stuff, he's joking around and all this, and he dies. Okay. But let me just say this. He was put into the Bay Area Sports Hall of Fame in 1981. The Japanese recognized him in their Hall of Fame in 2002. He also was instrumental, I think, when he became a coach on the San Francisco Giants. He cultivated Willie Mays and, McCovey, and, well, not so much Willie Mays. He had, I think, a slight riff with Willie Mays, but McCovey and Orlando Zapata and all these guys coming up. And, they honored O'Doul, and they honored him in Japan. And I think you brought up that pitcher. He was the first Japanese pitcher for the Giants, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Masanori Murakami. He came in 1964. Lefty had just kind of finished. He was a part-time hitting instructor, as you mentioned, for the Giants, and had just finished those duties when one of Lefty's former business partners, Cappy Harada, brokered a deal to bring Masanori Murakami to San Francisco. And that was a big moment for Lefty because, in fact, when Murakami went to the mound and pitched first game, Lefty was watching in his bar 3,000 miles away. Murakami was pitching against the Mets in New York. And after that first pitch, he kind of raised a toast and said, "I've been waiting 30 years for this day." He always thought Japanese would play in the major leagues. And I think that's really, his legacy. I mean, you're talking about a guy who was so popular in Japan in 49, by some counts, there were 1 million people lining the route. It wasn't just people don't really understand how popular he was and how much this meant to him to have a Japanese player in the major leagues. And it took another 30 years for the next one to come, but certainly we're seeing the globalization of the game over the last couple of decades, and especially influx of players from all over Asia. And I think Lefty has a big legacy, a big part of that.
And you know something? It's a shame because in '81, he's in the Bay Area Sports Hall of Fame. In 2002, the Japanese recognized him. Where's Cooperstown?
Well, I think the problem with Cooperstown is that they only look at the playing career. And while Lefty, he retired, he has the 4th highest lifetime batting average of any player in Major League history, higher than Ted Williams and Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth and Joe DiMaggio. But his peak career was really about 5 years. And, his backers always point to Dizzy Dean as kind of a corollary. But that's always been the argument. He has the requisite 10 years, but 4 of those he didn't really play at all. And a couple of years he was a platoon player or a part-time player. And I think the Hall of Fame only looks at the playing career. And I think they miss something when they don't look at other aspects. Lefty, sponsored youth teams all over, in Japan, in Canada, in the United States, often out of his own pocket. His influence on the game with young people, his influence in Japan, his influence as a hitting instructor, his overall impact on the game goes beyond the player he was, and he was a great player. But he was also stuck in the Coast League at a time when the minor leagues were independent and held on to players. So he was kind of stuck, kind of reserve clause squared in a way. He really was trapped. And so he may have been playing major league caliber ball in the Coast League, but, he's not in the majors. So he was a great player, but at the same time, I think these other aspects should be considered as well for anybody when you're looking at the Hall of Fame. Their overall impact on the game in addition to just the playing part of it.
And let me ask you one final question. How long did it take you to construct this book between the research and, just sitting down and just taking your research and constructing the book?
I spent about 3 to 3.5 years on this book. I wanted to get it right. I did have cooperation of Lefty's family. I had real help with some historians both here and in Japan that I mentioned in the book, Rob Fitz, Yoichi Nagata, or two, Dick Beveridge of the Pacific Coast League Hall. He's in the Pacific Coast League Hall of Fame now, and the president of the Historical Society, and some great documents from Japan that I received. and all those things really help put the picture together. But Lefty, as you can tell, there's not just one theme. Lefty's a pretty complicated person to report on because there's just a lot of aspects to him. There's not like one overarching theme with him. He had influence in a lot of ways on the game of baseball, and just a fascinating and interesting individual, as well as being accomplished and important.
You know, Dennis, I had a great time today. I don't know about you, but this was a stellar interview. I hope you had a good time today talking with me.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. It's always fun talking about Lefty and being able to take the time to go through. I mean, we haven't even touched on everything about Lefty. You could talk about him for hours. Just an incredible individual and someone who, as you said at the outset, really deserves to be remembered, and you wonder why he's not. And hopefully this will help bring his legacy a little bit more into focus.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you want, we'll do another show on Lefty, and you could fill in what I might have left out. We've gone an hour. I could talk forever, but I don't think my listeners would appreciate taking 2-3 hours when they're married, have kids. But we'll have you back on the show because I had a really good time. Hold the line because I'm going to end the show, and then I'll talk to you after I close down the show. This is how I usually end my shows. Folks, had a great time with Dennis. Had a great time learning so much about Lefty O'Doul. Go out, get this book. You'll learn more about Lefty O'Doul than you ever wanted to know, and why he's that important, and the contributions he made not only to American baseball, Major League, and the Pacific Leagues, but his time in Japan is such a valuable subject in the history of baseball. It has to be recognized. Go out, go get it. You can find it on Amazon. Where else could you find it, Dennis?
Barnes & Noble, University of Nebraska Press, of course, the publisher. I also have a Facebook page for the book where I put some bonus material and photos. It's Lefty O'Doul, Baseball's Forgotten Ambassador. They can go on there and like the page and look at it. And pretty much any bookstore you can order it. Amazon, University of Nebraska Press, Barnes & Noble, et cetera, all the usual outlets.
Very good. And as always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. Thank you, Dennis, for being on the show. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.